Good evening, everyone. We'll give it a minute or two for everybody to join. Okay, well, I think I'll go ahead, even though there are probably still some people joining us. My name's Hugh Thomas. I'm the director of the Center for the Humanities, and I'm very happy to welcome you to this year's first book talk, which is actually supposed to be last year, but got canceled because of the pandemic. But we're pleased to have the book talks this year in a new Zoom format, format I'm sure most of you are used to by now. Before I turn it over to John Paul Russo, who's going to introduce our speaker for the evening, I want to just say a few words about upcoming events. We have a number of book talks this year. They're all going to be at 8 o'clock on Wednesday nights. The next one is Wednesday, October 7th. Britt Brogard from the philosophy department will be talking about hatred, understanding our most dangerous emotion. Then on October 28th, Christina Lane from the School of Communications will be talking about her book, Phantom Lady, Hollywood producer Jean Harrison, the forgotten woman behind Hitchcock. And then in November, Melvin Butler from the Frost Music School will be talking about his book on Pentecostal music and identity in Jamaica and the US. In addition to the book talks, we're having some other series. The first is our Stanford Onlines. We had to postpone our regular Stanfords, but we got some people we were planning on for next year coming the following year. But we've got some people doing webinars. The first of these is September 24th at 7, Nelson Torres Maldonado, talking on the issue of Are Decolonial Humanities Possible? Another new program this year is introducing humanities faculty at UM in a slightly different way than we do in book talks. In book talks, people talk about their recently published books. In these talks, people will talk about their work more generally. And our first of these will be on Monday, September 28th at 7 by Chantal Acevedo in our fiction writing department. And her talk will be on historical fiction, novelist's approach to researching and writing in 19th century Cuba. So tonight we'll be talking about this book by Jennifer Ferriss-Hill. And to introduce her, I'm going to be turning it over to my colleague, John Paul Russo.
Thank you very much, Dean Backus, Professor Thomas, distinguished guests, faculty, students, and friends both online and listening on their phones. I warmly welcome you to this book presentation by Professor Jennifer Ferriss-Hill. Professor Ferriss-Hill is Senior Associate Dean for Academic Affairs in the College of Arts and Sciences and Associate Professor of Classics at the University of Miami. Her book is Ars Poetica, Family, Friendship, and the Art of Living, published by Princeton University Press. This event was originally scheduled to take place at Books and Books on March 19th, which now seems far away and long ago, so much longer than the 6 months that have passed. I was honored to have been invited to introduce the speaker at that time, but even more so this evening, when Professor Ferriss-Hill's powerful commentary on one of Horace's finest works has an immediate connection to our present circumstance. Horace, in his poems, has the inner voice of the closest friend as he explores family, friendship, and the art of living, among many other themes. It has been said that Horace's values are immensely trustworthy, level-headed, and compatible with almost any society. There are no barriers to reading him, except maybe learning Latin. He finds his audience in every generation. No author's poetry was more carefully copied and preserved. We think we have all his works, a rarity among ancient authors. In some, he's one of the universal artists to have come down to us from an ancient world. Professor Ferriss-Hill received her BA degree in classics, summa cum laude, from Princeton, and her PhD in classical philology from Harvard. Her first book, Roman Satire and the Old Comic Tradition, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2015. The following year, it won the First Book Award from the Classical Association of the Middle West and South. Second books are even more difficult to write. I'm not referring to those second books that are just the first book all over again in different dress. Not Professor Ferriss-Hill's, whose second book may be even better than her first. It is exceedingly difficult to come up with a genuinely original idea about a major event in the ancient world, like the fall of Rome, or about a famous ancient work like Horace's Art of Poetry. I was trained in the history of literary criticism and have taught Horace's Art of Poetry for decades. The poem is second only to Aristotle's Poetics as the most influential work in the history of Western literary criticism. When Professor Ferriss-Hill told me about the thesis of her second book, as yet unwritten, it came as a revelation and my blood ran cold. I realized immediately that I had been reading the work in the wrong way, as a literary manual and not on a poem on the art of living. Like many other scholars and critics, I made the mistake of reading the work as I had been taught, and not for the far more impressive poem that Horace had written. While Professor Hill will tell that story, I only wanted to record my first impression of this book, one that students and scholars are beginning to share around the world, and to reiterate the excitement and power that a really new idea can exert over us. It is with great pleasure that I welcome Professor Jennifer Ferriss-Hill.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, John Paul, for that incredibly kind and generous introduction. I very much appreciate it. I'm going to share my screen so that I can show my slide presentation. There we go. Okay. Thank you so much to all of you for being here. And as was mentioned, this book talk was supposed to take place in March, and then we ended up in our present situation, to which we've all adapted by doing things such as this virtually. So I'm very pleased to have been invited back to kick off the academic year 2020-2021 book talk series. Thank you very much to Hugh Thomas, Director of the Center for the Humanities, and to Megan Homer, the Assistant Director, and also to Books and Books, at whose physical location in Coral Gables this would ordinarily be taking place. I, of course, can't sign copies tonight as I would have been able to there, but if you've purchased the book and would like it signed, please bring it at any time to my office on the second floor of the Ash building on campus. So I wrote a book, my second, about a single poem, 476 lines long, called the Ars Poetica, which means art of poetry, by a Latin poet named Horace, who lived in the 1st century BCE. The book was published by Princeton University Press last November 2019, and here is the cover, which I must admit it took me a little while to get used to. I had visions of something more like this, a beautiful illuminated manuscript of the poem's opening lines, specifically its opening letter, an H for HUMANO, human, the poem's first word, with the strange creature drawn inside the H that is described in these opening lines. But as happened with my first book, I was told that I have no idea what sort of look sells academic books successfully, and I was given the cover on the left, which apparently was much better. Big, bold letters and no image. But it really has grown on me, and it does capture something essential about the book as well, the verdant, organic qualities that I see in the poem, embodied in the green color and in the leaf print that forms the background behind the bold lettering. I've been living with this book project for a long time. I first really read the Ars Poetica in graduate school in a seminar on ancient literary criticism, and it somehow got to me because I felt like I really didn't understand it well and couldn't wrap my head around it. In fact, I kept thinking about it, and I really wanted to write my PhD dissertation on it, but I couldn't figure out what to say. And so I ended up writing my dissertation about a different set of poems by Horace, the same author. I wrote about his satires and about the genre of Roman verse satire with its four practitioners, Lucilius, Horace, Persius, and Juvenal, and how the poetry they were writing in the 1st and 2nd centuries BCE and CE reinvented for their later time and place the ancient Greek old comic plays of 5th century BCE Athens. My first book, Roman Satire in the Old Comic Tradition, was published in 2015 by Cambridge University Press, and it really required me writing this first book about Roman satire to be able to write this second one, because I came to realize that Horace's satires and his Ars Poetica were really like bookends to his literary career that mirrored one another in a very interesting way. In his satires, Horace appears to be writing about human foibles and failings, about ethics and daily life. But beneath all of this, he's often writing about writing. And in his Ars Poetica, which purports to be a manual on how to write a poem and gives lots of supposed advice and instruction about how to do this, except most of it is spectacularly useless, I argue that he's really also writing about all the stuff he writes about in his satires, how to live and how to be in this world. Horace remained interested in this intersection of ethics and aesthetics throughout his life and poetic career. But the idea that the way you should do one thing is the way you should do everything found itself expressed in different forms early on and later in his writing, and in ways that mirror one another and bookend his other collections of poems, the epodes, and most famously his odes, which you might know as a source of the phrase carpe diem, seize the day. My argument is that the Ars Poetica has suffered unduly from the misconception, and it is a misconception, that it was intended as a manual, and that it was actually used as a manual throughout the Middle Ages and Renaissance. This misunderstanding of the poem has been almost universal and has persisted until recently, and in fact it will continue to persist if people just don't believe my reading of the poem. Andrew Laird, for example, describes the Ars Poetica as an object of imitation, as well as a code of practice for Renaissance poets and playwrights, a kind of literary magna carta for norms and principles that were earnestly applied to literature, drama, and other art forms well into the 18th century. That earnestly is very telling. And Kirsten Fries Jensen similarly says that anyone who desired to learn the rules of poetry writing would turn to Horace's Art of Poetry, guided by a teacher or an up-to-date commentary. And that medieval interpreters of Horace's Ars Poetica all shared the view that the poem is entirely didactic. I should add that Horace himself contributed to this misunderstanding of his poem by naming it Ars Poetica, as he almost certainly did, although we don't have any record that he himself called it this, or in fact called it anything at all. An ars is meant to instruct, to teach you how to do something. So if you wanted to learn grammar, you would consult an Ars Grammatica, or if you wanted to learn rhetoric, you would get your hands on an Ars Rhetorica. The Ars Poetica, moreover, is addressed to a father and two sons. It talks extensively about drama, and it has therefore been part of the poem's laws since the outset that it was written, perhaps even at the family's request, as a manual to the father and sons on how to write a play, because, so the tradition goes, the sons must have been interested in becoming playwrights. However, the ancient tradition of mock didactic was also a rich one, and we therefore have faux manuals from the 4th, 3rd, and 2nd centuries BCE in both Greek and Latin many of which teach cooking, oddly, in a satirical fashion. And there seems to have been something in the air in Rome in the 1st century BCE as well, around mock didactic. Ovid, for example, wrote the Ars Amatoria, the art of love, which purports to be a handbook teaching the art of seduction. And it's thought to be this poem, actually, that got him exiled because it undermined the Emperor Augustus's moral reforms. As a result of this misunderstanding of the poem, a misunderstanding that Horace himself set in motion, and perhaps deliberately, the Ars Poetica has been fairly thoroughly ignored or actively disliked. Ignored because why would a manual be interesting? And disliked because its generations of devoted readers deserve scorn, apparently, for having, as people suppose, taken it seriously. So already in the 16th century, Julius Caesar Scaliger called it an ars sine arte tradita, an art handed down without art, or an artless art, right? Something that was supposed to teach the art of poetry, but was not itself poetically artful. Another common criticism of the poem is that it is disjointed, poorly put together, or lacks structure, a series of more or less random reflections, as H. Rushton Fairclough said. One of my favorite negative descriptions of the poem is that of Lionel Trilling, the great 20th century literary scholar and New York intellectual, who dismissed it as a crashing bore and a disaster to literature. At the same time, however, he expresses surprise at the anomaly of its having been written by a great poet, and confesses that he is otherwise engaged and delighted and quite often moved by Horace. I'm not sure whether he means that it is a disaster as a literary work, or whether, more subtly, and I think this is what he did mean, he means that the Ars Poetica has exacted damage on the subsequent literary tradition because it was used as an interpretive guide in a way that really did not yield meaningful results. Either way, Trilling finds the poem a crashing bore. Around 10 years ago, Victoria Moule was still able to describe the poem as unfashionable today, unfashionable even amongst classicists, and certainly so among non-specialists. My book, in a sense, has been an effort to rehabilitate Horace's Ars Poetica, because I think it's actually a lot more interesting than people have given it credit for. But part and parcel with that, I don't really think it's about poetry in any fundamental sense. And that assertion, as my dear colleague Jean-Paul Rousseau was saying, has caused him some heart palpitations, I'm afraid, although I think I succeeded in convincing him of my argument in the end. At the root of the problem, as I see it, is the tension between the idea that the poem was sincerely used as a manual by benighted inhabitants of the Middle Ages, and the fact that, as a manual, it's really not very helpful. Here is an illustrative example. Either the matter is acted out on stage or things done are reported. It's hard to imagine any other option, though, for a play. Either you do show the action unfolding on stage, or you have a character describe what has happened off stage. What else could there possibly be? Or the warning, a few lines later, that certain types of actions, such as murder and metamorphosis, were not permissible to be shown on stage. This would have been well known to anyone setting out to write a play. Or the reminder that a play should contain 5 acts and have 3 speaking characters. Again, this information should have been so familiar and obvious to any would-be playwright that Horace must be up to something else in including these sorts of injunctions in his poem. That something else, I suggest, is dressing up his poem in just enough of these sorts of traditional and plausible sounding pronouncements that it can pass as an ars. In addition, most of the advice that Horace gives throughout the poem is negative and amounts largely to don't write badly, which of course is true, but is not very helpful if you're consulting a manual to try to figure out how exactly to write well. So, was the poem ever used sincerely as a manual for its precepts? Here too, I would take issue with the subsequent tradition that laughs at 2 millennia of preceding readership for having supposedly done so. An anonymous 12th century commentary to the Ars Poetica explains in its introduction to the poem that writing about the art, de arte, is to teach precepts about it, but working from the art, ex arte, is to follow the teacher's precepts. This distinction between de arte and ex arte, between presentation or external qualities and content or internal qualities, was one commonly made since antiquity and throughout the Middle Ages. Fries Jensen accordingly speaks of the double message that medieval students of the Ars Poetica would work to glean. A close scrutiny of the literary perfection of a classical masterpiece was in itself rewarding, he says, And in this case, the classical poem was also a didactic text which, properly understood, would teach the rules of the art. Horace's Ars Poetica is not didactic in its vacuous pronouncements about the correct number of acts or speaking characters, but rather as a constitutive document that is valuable for how it says what it says and for the fact and form of its existence. This, it turns out, is what a work called On Poems by a writer named Philodemus was about. What makes a poem good, Richard Janko explains of Philodemus's literary doctrine, is not the sound, but the combination of words and sense. Although the sound appeals to the ear, the most important pleasure we obtain from poetry is in the mind, and such is therefore the function of verse. Philodemus was a rough contemporary of Horace, and they seem to have moved in the same literary circles, although it is not clear that they ever actually met. Intriguingly, Philodemus's patron was a man named Lucius Calpurnius Piso Caesoninus, and the Ars Poetica is addressed to a father and sons named Piso. Moreover, the Piso family may have owned the Villa dei Papiri in Herculaneum, which was buried in the famous eruption of Vesuvius in 79, and which has already, for several centuries, been yielding up its trove of blackened papyri, among them quite a lot of previously unknown works by Philodemus, which we're now able to read with the aid of infrared and X-ray technologies. From the recent papyrological and textual work on these remains of Philodemus, it is clear that, as the quote says from David Sider, Philodemus was far more concerned with the relationship between form and content and other literary matters than he was with content alone. David Armstrong also notes Philodemus's approach to literature, which is simultaneously atomistic and macroscopic, as the pleasure derived from poetry resides in the appreciation of arrangement and unity built up, as in the universe, from the tiniest elements into a coherent whole. In this, whether he directly influenced them or not, Philodemus was followed by both Horace and Virgil, who likewise demonstrate the uncanny ability to arrange in indissolubly perfect order the letters, sounds, words, and verses of their poems into a greater whole. The Ars Poetica thus becomes, in its entirety, a full and complete exemplum of an ideal poem. A person who merely follows the rules stated within it will not produce beautiful verses. Rather, through careful and continued study of the whole, we may begin to discern, first here and there, and gradually more and more, the qualities and habits of mind and of practice that make a preeminent poet and poem. The work's didactic content lies not where it appears to, that is, in its dicta and pronouncements, but in the ways that these and its other ideas are expressed and especially welded together. Readers who have maligned the poem as a failed manual have done so on account perhaps of their own short-sightedness for not reading it ex arte, but rather de arte, as well as for assuming that their predecessors did the same and therefore valued the poem in a simplistic or naive way. So this is how the poem begins. Human, to a human head, if a painter should wish to join a horse's neck and make multicolored feathers grow on limbs gathered from all over, so that horribly in a black fishtail she ends, a beautiful woman up above, would you, friends let in for a viewing, hold back your laughter? This first sentence, 5 lines long, is as convoluted in Latin and odd as it is in English, as though the syntax mirrors the strangeness of the creature being described, the one that you might recall I wanted as my cover image. You can see them up here. Although the first word of the thought, and so of the entire poem, ought to be see, if, which is compelled to wait until the second line where it appears as a second word, Horace instead shoehorns in the word humano, human, as the poem's first, such that the work promises a concern with this. To the human head that begins the poem is attached a horse's neck, then come limbs sourced from all over and decorated with multicolored feathers, and finally a black fishtail. After which, Horace circles back to the head and deigns to tell us that it belongs to a beautiful woman, so forcing us to revise the mental image we had been making, because in this Roman milieu, a human head would by default be a man's. The figure appears to be a jumble of pieces, yet Horace seems to be asking us to assemble, or at least attempt to assemble, the pieces he casts before us into a coherent whole, since we are, after all, supposed to be looking at a painting. Horace has given us beginning, head, middle, torso, and end, tail, as Aristotle instructed, even as the Ars Poetica overall is often accused of not possessing clearly these three components. Jumping into its subject without preliminaries and lacking a conventional conclusion. But Horace also violates a compositional principle that he articulates less than 150 lines later when he instructs, let not the middle part be discordant from the first, the last from the middle. And so he begins by showing us what not to do. But Horace is doing a number of other things in these opening lines as well. In the fifth line, we are suddenly placed into the persons of the painter's friends, as Horace turns to address us as AMICI, friends, invited for a first viewing of the painting. And we are instructed, or rather forced, to respond with laughter, or more specifically, to respond by restraining the laughter that Horace suggests we are struggling to hold in. Would you, friends let in for a viewing, hold back your laughter? We perform these actions whether we wish to or not, controlled wholly by the poet, and our only choice in the matter would be to lay aside the poem entirely. Horace thus makes clear at the outset that if we are to read the poem on the terms demanded, we must read slowly and submit to being led by the nose to wherever Horace wishes. If we thought for a moment we were friends, perhaps even the poet's own friends, admitted to view this poem, the readership is next addressed as PISONES. Believe, Pisos, Horace says, that just like that painting would be a book, whose images will be fashioned to be empty, like a sick man's dreams, such that neither head nor foot can be reconciled with a single form. Painters and poets have always had the same opportunity to dare whatever they wish, some interlocutor interjects, allowing Horace to set up his retort. We know, and we ask for, and we grant this indulgence by turns, but not with the result that harsh things combine with gentle ones, not with the result that serpents be paired with birds, lambs with tigers. So one should juxtapose and combine things, but this must be done in moderation and tastefully. Horace performs an opening that is disjointed and bewildering, yet there is also richness and even harmony in the heterogeneity of Horace's painted creature. And if we only search, we may find that the opening of the Ars Poetica conceals something else valuable, a full representation of the poem itself. Although Horace has tricked us, or at the very least let us know that he has complete control over us, his readers, the promise heralded by HUMANO will be fulfilled in the course of the poem. The Ars Poetica is concerned above all with human behavior and endeavors, the purview of the satires. In this sense, despite the lack of unity displayed as well as embodied in the opening 5 lines, Horace has succeeded in achieving the sort of unity prescribed by Aristotle. For I see each thematic strand that I trace in my book throughout the poem present as a single word in the poem's opening, which therefore contains in embryonic form the entirety of the poem that unfurls from it. A critical function of this opening is to prime the reader to perceive throughout the Ars Poetica its currents of human activity, its fathers and sons, teachers and students, intergenerational relationships and life cycles. The notion that true criticism is best delivered by one's friends through laughter, even at the risk of pain, and the central role of painting, which will be consistently privileged over poetry, and which anticipates the idea that all forms of making and creating are in essence the same. Above all, the poem's opening makes the careful reader alert to the ways in which these various themes will be stitched together, sometimes seamlessly, and sometimes with the seams left showing. So, HUMANO, human, the first word of the poem and the title of chapter 1, heralds the Ars Poetica's concern with all that living entails, casting the scope of the work far beyond poetry from the outset. As the poem progresses, this interest is borne out by Horace's striking focus on human emotions, on life cycles, whether of people or words, and on nature and human nature. How different people behave or should behave at different times of their lives is given far greater prominence that seems justified when Horace's concern is ostensibly about how to create believable characters for the stage. And here I see the tone and interests that characterize Horace's satires creeping into his Ars Poetica. Horace's concern, I go on to argue, is with all human endeavor, the ars vivendi, art of living. Horace is also deeply interested in language, not just as a tool for his poetic craft, but as something that, like other living things, including people, can be born and die out, or can be given new life through an unusual usage or placement. The kaleda junctura, you can see that in one of the bullets on the right. That means clever join. Most importantly, in chapter 1, I take the reader on kind of a stroll through the poem, partly as a necessary precursor to the discussion in the chapters that follow, but partly because the way in which the Ars Poetica is didactic is the one thing Horace cannot or will not articulate, all while he articulates plenty of other not especially useful pedagogical points. He cannot say, and so he shows instead how a verbal texture makes a poem, and how, through such texturing, certain ideas may be accorded preeminence of place. Chapter 2, Pisones, takes its title from the family name of the addressees. They were conflated with the amici addressed in the line before, and the extent to which the poet's friends, the painter's friends, the Pisones, and we, or the other reader, are blurred in these lines is notable. Much of the scholarly conversation around the Pisones has centered upon their identity. Are they Lucius Calpurnius Piso and his sons, or Gaius Calpurnius Piso and his sons? Despite the attractive connection with Philodemus that Lucius Calpurnius Piso would provide, and despite the family's clear interest in literary patronage more generally, Lucius is not known to have had any sons of the age that the sons in the poem must be if they're interested in a literary career. Gaius Calpurnius Piso, on the other hand, who did have sons of approximately the right age, is said to have possessed a familial temperament marked by arrogance and brutality, which is thought to render him an unsuitable candidate as the addressee of an Ars Poetica. The identity of the addressees has been debated since antiquity, since the poem's composition. And so I suggest that this is part of the point. Horace, as he sometimes does, is playing a joke on his readers by making them work to solve an insoluble problem and to decide between two alternatives, one of which would be almost perfect but doesn't quite fit, Lucius Calpurnius Piso, and the other of which would render the poem a sort of joke, an Ars Poetica to addressees with plainly no interest in poetry. I therefore see Horace addressing not so much a specific Father Piso and his sons, but rather a particular class of person, Rockefellers or Kennedys, for example, a name that conjures up power, wealth, political and social connections, and influence. These sorts of people, because of their social standing, think that they can become poets. In fact, Horace says this in the Ars Poetica. Being born into a particular station makes you a good candidate for being a politician or a lawyer, but not for being a poet. And perhaps these people have even commissioned a work about how to become poets, but Horace is emphatic that they cannot. Only one can become a poet who has been born equipped with the necessary talent and who has undergone the arduous, unending work of cultivating and honing that talent. This is the fundamental message of the Ars Poetica, throughout which Horace shows off what he can do and what the Pisones and perhaps other readers cannot. And I argue that Horace subjects the Pisones to a far less gentle handling than has been generally acknowledged, a handling that is in line with his aggressive treatment of some addressees and other figures in his satires and epistles. I further explore in chapter 2 how, in dedicating his poem to a unit consisting of a father and two sons, Horace is able to make the father-son relationship a central narrative strand of the Ars Poetica, and with it the theme of teaching. Ultimately, I see Horace presenting a studied evolution of his poetic persona, from student son in the satires, written at the beginning of his career, in which we see him receiving teachings from his own father, to an older teacher father figure in the Ars Poetica, written at the end, in which he instructs the Piso boys. Two key words from the opening, amici, friends, and risum, laughter, unite to form the focus of the third chapter, as I show how they run the length of the Ars Poetica, appearing sometimes singly and at other times in unison, but always such that the senses of each crystallize further with every instance. Their first appearance in the poem's opening sets the scene for all that follows. An artist must have an audience, and so it is that as soon as Horace has drawn for us with his words a painting in the opening lines of the Ars Poetica, an audience, the amici, is conjured up to view and react to it. Perhaps the artist imagined, that in inviting his friends for the first viewing, he has guaranteed that their response will be one of praise. But instead, his friends react with laughter, RISUM, that they struggle to restrain. But the moment is left unresolved for now. We are not told at this point whether they let the laughter out or are successful in restraining it. Laughter will prove germane to the ways in which artist and audience relate to each other throughout the poem. And from the first, it is inseparable from friendship. It's self-intertwined with the persons of the PISONES. Drawing on work by Philodemus, Horace explores throughout the Ars Poetica the paradox that the obligation of a true friend is to criticize, especially through laughter, even at the risk of causing pain. Because by sparing a friend from short-term pain, by not making fun of his terrible work, he runs the risk of exposing him to greater pain over the long run. A corollary of this is that criticisms issued by a friend are necessarily true. Within the framework of Roman and especially Epicurean friendship, Horace thus boldly negotiates for himself the position of friend in respect to the PISONES, even though these figures are mentioned nowhere else in his writings. This ruse of friendship is nevertheless what allows Horace to criticize his addressees' literary talents and to discourage them, along with the general reader, from attempting to become poets. The fourth chapter draws more generally on the equation of painting and poetry that opens the poem to argue that the Ars Poetica should be read as an Ars Poeticae, an art of making or creating. For Horace's interests lie in the overlap of all human pursuits. The Greek verb poiein is a source of the Latin word poetica, and with it are poet, poem, poetry, but it is rather more wide-ranging in its senses, encompassing make, produce, bring into existence, cause, or just do. That is making or creating in a multitude of forms. The poem is an art of doing everything. Finally, Horace concludes the Ars Poetica by indulging himself in a flight of the sublime, I argue, showing off one final definitive time and ending the poem's conversation on creative endeavor by revealing his superior and unmatchable mastery of the literary art. If the poem's beginning has not been well liked, its ending has been outright disliked. But the ending both mirrors the beginning and is key to cementing the themes of the poem. Describing a poet whose poetry stems from his madness, Horace says, and this is in the quote, "Nor is it very clear why he keeps making verses, whether he urinated onto his father's ashes or sacrilegiously disturbed a gloomy spot struck by lightning. The suggestion is that the person in question has deliberately committed an act of sacrilege and been punished by the gods for his transgression with a madness that has rendered him a poet. But the image of the son urinating onto his father's ashes in their grave is so disturbing in a poem that is addressed to a father and sons and that explores the father-son relationship throughout in fairly positive terms. We are left wondering whether one or both of the Piso sons is so desperate to become a poet that they would try this method. This deranged poet, moreover, subjects others to his compositions. He rages, and like a bear, Horace says, if it has been strong enough to break the bars blocking its cage, the bitter reciter causes the taught and untaught man alike to flee. The one whom in fact he seizes, he keeps hold of him and kills him by reading, not about to let go of the skin unless full of blood, a leech." So this is the ending of the poem, and I would draw your attention to the fact that cruoris herudo mirrors HUMANO capiti, with the H and the C with which the poem begins. The poem opened with what in retrospect was a comparatively positive image of an audience reacting to an artwork. True friends, they are on the point of laughing, and ends with a reciter who reads his single audience member to death and is left with no audience at all and clutching a sack of skin that has been depleted of its blood. Moreover, the animal imagery of bear and leech mirrors that of the creature with which the poem opened, the organic, natural element running its entire length. In the introduction, I tried to show how the Ars Poetica had come to attain the standing that it did over 2 millennia, as the only classical essay on literary criticism that has been known with something like continuity from the date of its composition to the present day, the Norton Anthology says that it would be impossible to overestimate the importance of Horace's Ars Poetica for the subsequent history of literary criticism. In the book's epilogue, however, I suggest that if the Ars Poetica's poetic qualities have not always been clear to scholars of literature, they seem to have been more evident to the practicing writers who, inspired by Horace's poem, wrote Ars Poeticae of their own. This word cloud, which includes the alternate names used of the Ars Poetica and those of the works that Horace himself drew on as he wrote his poem, gives you a sense of the volume of commentaries, translations, and imitations of the poem, as well as of the number of later writers, including dozens of contemporary poets, who have written poems that they've titled something like Ars Poetica, so marking them as being, in one way or another, in the Horatian tradition or as part of the same literary universe and conversation. I focus on those later arts of poetry that seem to reveal that their authors read the Ars Poetica as I suggest reading it, not as a manual to be applied to the mechanical tasks of literary composition, but as an artistic achievement in its own right, a hexameter poem by a poet whose other hexameter poems include satires, and a work concerned not with what it may explicitly state, but rather with the implicit and interlaced themes introduced from its opening vignette. Above all, practicing poets have long discerned what many literary scholars have not, that the poem's value lies not so much in its stated contents as in its finely spun internal unity, which supersedes its explicit topical breaks, and that its coherence emerges through judicious echoes and re-echoes of individual words and sounds and images. The argument I make in my book for reading the Ars Poetica as a literary achievement in its own right may therefore be viewed as a return to the complex, nuanced ways in which it was read already in the Middle Ages, through the 16th century, and into the 21st. Fascinated and frustrated in equal measure by the Ars Poetica, Goethe wrote that this problematic work strikes one reader differently from another, and differently again every 10 years. I think he's right, and I think the book I wrote now about this poem is quite different from the one I would have written as a PhD student when I first started really thinking about the Ars Poetica. And if I write another book about it in another decade, undoubtedly that one will be quite different too. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. We already have a question, which I'll come to in just a minute, but before turning to the questions, I want to say a little bit about how that'll work, although you may have seen in the chat how it works. But in any case, what we'd like you to do is type questions into the question and answer button. If you take your mouse to the bottom of the screen, you'll see a little Q&A thing, and you can type it in there, and I'll read it, and Professor Ferriss-Hill will answer it. But before turning to the first question, I'll just make a quick, I'll make a quick correction. One of the talks I gave the wrong date for, this is Chantal Acevedo's. You have to register by the 28th, but the talk itself is on October 1st. So if you have questions, do type them in. Have several questions from Anna Bistrick, happily the first one is something I was also curious about as a medievalist. She asked about the illuminated manuscript initials. I'm not sure if one or both, and I was struck by how what seemed in the first case like a medieval sort of random, typical random kind of illumination actually fits the text quite well. Do we know anything about, I imagine we know the date, but I'm not sure we know anything beyond that about the illuminations, the rough date.
I gathered a whole set of images as I was preparing to suggest cover images to the publisher that they then ended up not using. And the two that I showed you are really the two most kind of elaborate and evocative. It's quite common to draw this like little female sea creature with feathers But those were the most striking ones. I'll be happy to look up the details and send them to the person who asked the question. But one of them is definitely from the Vatican, and I think that one of the others is from the British Library, but it took quite a bit of hunting to find them.
Sorry, I thought I had unmuted. I actually remembered, but the button didn't quite work. So Anna Bistrick, who asked the first question, helped along by me, has some more questions, but I'll move to another question by John Oksanish, which is fairly specific. It talks, he mentions thinking about Epistle 1.1 and Horace's emphasis on his own insania, and ask if you could say more about the place of, if I'm reading this correctly, self-contradiction, as it may, as in the first lines of the Ars Poetica, as it may relate to the Philosophical Life Advice Project. So that's a fair amount of question, but hopefully you can handle it.
Thank you, John, for attending and for all of these questions, all the way from Wake Forest. People have really struggled with the idea of whether Horace in the Ars Poetica is actually saying that he himself is mad. And one of the reasons why perhaps they have a struggle with this is, apart from the fact that it presents him in kind of a negative light. Was he born mad? What did he do to get his poetic madness? It doesn't seem to fit neatly into this really widespread aesthetic dichotomy in the ancient world, in which you are either, like Pindar and Aeschylus, a poet of inspiration that produces voluminous, powerful verses, or you are a poet in the tradition of slender, carefully crafted poetry, which is most often represented by Callimachus, the Hellenistic poets, the Alexandrian tradition. And Horace so clearly and consistently places himself in the Callimachian tradition of a person who puts the greatest possible effort into his work, but whose effort isn't always appreciated. This is a common theme in the satires. So that I think it's been hard in the Ars Poetica to reconcile him as also being a poet of inspiration. But I think his fundamental point is that you always need both, right? You always need inborn talent, and you need to have done something with that inborn talent. And one of the moments in the Ars Poetica that's very striking to me is that he uses these key words, right? So HUMANO, PISONES, AMICI, RISUM, friendship and laughter, over and over again throughout the poem in these very strategic ways. And he uses the adverb amice, which means in a friendly manner, but also in the manner of a friend, to describe how talent and effort need to interact to produce good art. And it's striking because he's suggesting that he, as a friend of the Pisones, is able to criticize them, but also a positive type of friendship that allows these two required poets to collaborate. So I actually think that Horace is, in the Ars Poetica, is presenting himself as something more than a Callimachian tradition poet, as he often does in the satires. And on the role of self-contradiction, I think this is the other thing that makes, to me, the Ars Poetica seem so much like the satires, that Horace in the satires is a very slippery figure. And it's very difficult to figure out exactly, when he says something as a joke, does he mean it seriously, right? So you think you have your finger on it, but then he backs away and says, no, I didn't mean it. But then, no, I actually did mean it. But then, no, I didn't mean it. And I see that same kind of vacillation and the effect that it has on the reader, where the reader is never quite sure what he's saying seriously and what he's saying not seriously, as operative throughout the Ars Poetica as well.
Next question is from Yoandi Cabrera. The question is the traditional title of the Ars Poetica, is that in itself a problem? Would there be a more suitable title for this epistle?
It's funny you should ask that. So I discussed this in the introduction to my book. The poem is known by a number of different names, but the title of Ars Poetica is the one that is most widespread in the Anglophone classical tradition. In other countries, in Europe, it is more typical to refer to it as Epistles 2.3. So Horace wrote 2 books of epistles, and the second book of epistles contains 2 poems, and the Ars Poetica is treated as though it is the 3rd poem of this book. So we don't know what he called it. And we don't know whether he called it anything. And in fact, I find the hermeneutics of titling to be very, very interesting. And there were a number of different conventions in the ancient world, but to me, it seems unlikely that he would not have called it something, because by titling the work, you are priming the reader to read it in a particular way. And I think that Horace primes his reader to understand it as an Ars Poetica. If you start reading this poem, it's 20 or 30 lines before you would have any notion that you are actually reading an Ars Poetica. It's really only the title that makes the reader think of that strange opening image at the beginning as having something to do with an Ars Poetica. So I think it's very likely that he called it that himself. I think it's very likely that he called it that deliberately in a slightly confusing and misleading fashion. And I think that's because, as I was saying, in the 1st century BCE, there were a number of kind of, not exactly mock didactic, but sort of paradidactic, kind of a parallel tradition of didactic Ars works being written, like Ovid's Ars Amatoria, which I mentioned earlier. Varro also wrote something that's, again, about food in this long mock epic tradition of food. Did I cover all the points in that question? Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I'm going to ask a related question from David Abraham and then put my own twist on it. He asked, what do you think were the chief impediments to a sympathetic reading of the poem for so long? But my twist is, in your epilogue, you talk about the fact that there were more sympathetic readings in the Middle Ages and the early modern period. So what went wrong, and then how did it go right again, so to speak?
I think that there is this tradition in academia and more generally to assume that you and your generation are cleverer than the generations that came before, and that you know more than the people that came before. And especially if you have a work that, I mean, I don't know how many times I have read this poem now, dozens and dozens and dozens, and I like it more every time I read it. But the first time I read it, I didn't like it very much. And it's much easier just to say, well, this poem isn't very interesting to me, so the people who liked it must not have been very intelligent. I think that's a fairly common human trait. The other thing that happened, though, I mentioned that this is the only work on literary criticism that has been known with something like continuity from the time of its composition to the present day. And some of you may have thought about Aristotle's Poetics, which also obviously was written before this was written and is still known today, but it was lost or just not read until about the 16th century. With the rediscovery of the Poetics, which again is much more than the Ars Poetica is, kind of an interpretive guide to writing literature and reading literature, these 2 works kind of almost instantly formed a pair and became read alongside each other. And in a sense, it prevented both of them from being themselves, right? The Poetics was kind of read as an Ars Poetica in Greek, and the Ars Poetica, as soon as the Poetics began to be read alongside it, was read as a Poetics that's not quite right. And in fact, people responded by trying to rearrange the lines of the Ars Poetica to make it more like Aristotle's Poetics and to have more of a kind of coherent seeming argument. So I think it has also suffered because it became one of this pair that then they kind of impeded the proper appreciation of one another for a long time.
Next question comes from my next door neighbor, Steve Cronin. Is it madness so much as a warning against those would-be poets who would buttonhole you to death if you let them?
Clearly the mad poet at the end is not a figure that one should desire to imitate. But this is where Horace is so slippery. I think he does believe, I think that in the Ars Poetica, he presents himself as a mad poet in the sense of a poet who works from inspiration. But the danger is that you can't fake it. So you can't commit an act of sacrilege, have the gods punish you with madness, and then become a poet that way. That's the wrong way. But of course, if you were born without the right kind of talent or madness, what do? Well, you can't do anything, right? So it's clearly a very, very serious warning. And this idea of reading people to death was then, I think it was Alexander Pope who, in his kind of later version of the Ars Poetica, was very struck by this image. And he essentially repeats the line.
Next, I'll turn to a question from John Kirby, and he finds your argument convincing, and asks, can you give some general thoughts on how Horace's approach to satire as philosophy differs from that of other Roman satirists?
I think that this is why, hi John, thank you for the question. I think that this is why Horace has lasted so long, in the sense that so many people have enjoyed reading him for so much time, which is that he always seems, as John Paul was saying in his nice introduction, to kind of speak to every generation in a slightly different way. And I think one of the reasons why he's able to do this, I wouldn't necessarily say more than the other satirists, Persius or Juvenal, is that instead of being in a single philosophical tradition, so Persius, for example, is very clearly a Stoic, Horace has a much more eclectic approach to the philosophical tradition around him and preceding him. And he really picks and chooses the elements from a wide array of different philosophical schools, and then kind of joins them together in his own idiosyncratic fashion to kind of form his own life philosophy. So he chooses very freely from especially Epicurean and Stoic ideas, but also there are some Cynic ideas in there as well. And I think because he's not so thoroughly pigeonholed into one way of thinking, he is offering up many different thoughts at once, but that also allows each reader to find for themselves what they find compelling and attractive in his satires. And I think, I don't know if I said this clearly enough, but I think that all of Horace's hexameter writings are essentially the same in spirit. So his epistles and his satires and his Ars Poetica, they're all written in dactylic hexameters, which was the meter that you used if you wanted to write epic, or if you wanted to write didactic, or if you wanted to write Roman satire. But the result is that if you take a line from any one of those three collections, I think most readers would be hard pressed to tell you exactly where that line or that idea comes from. The satires and the epistles and the Ars Poetica are so similar in worldview and in the thoughts and ideas that they present.
Although we're coming up to the end of the hour, I'm going to continue a little bit. Obviously, one of the nice things about being in a webinar is if you have to leave, you can do so without any sort of disruption. But we will go a little bit past 9, even if I'm not sure I'll get to all the questions. Robin Walsh asks, are there any roughly contemporaneous accounts that indicate whether the Ars was being understood as a satire by Horace's readers? And she qualifies roughly contemporaneous as being within 300 years. So is what classicists and medievalists kind of think of as contemporaneous.
Thank you for that question, and hi, Robin. It's interesting. We don't have any records before about the. It is almost 300, probably around 250 years before the first commentaries on the Ars Poetica began to appear. There's one by Terentius Scaurus around 200 and something, I think. So we don't know, simply because it's not recorded and they didn't tell us, what exactly contemporaneous readers thought. However, about the Ars Poetica. However, one of the pieces of evidence that I always use when I try to explain that really the satires and the epistles and the Ars Poetica are all hexameters and they're all doing kind of the same thing, is that even very early readers of Horace used the term satura, which is the genre term for Roman satire, to describe freely all of his hexameter writings, especially the epistles. So if the Ars Poetica seems like the third poem in the second book of epistles, and you can call epistles satura, I think the connection between the three collections becomes very clear. And in fact, Julius Caesar Scaliger, who in the 16th century said it was an artless art, the end of that quote is, "It is much more like satura." So already these readers were seeing that it really was like these other things that Horace had written, but also that it wasn't an Ars, a handbook in any kind of simple sense.
I'm going to lump two questions together because they're pretty similar about Horace's work and his contemporaries. Ellen Weston asks, is the convoluted sentence structure an attempt to mock his contemporaries and challenge them to interpret his work? And another question by Anna Bistrick is, Horace definitely intends for his reader to make parallels with their contemporary authors. Is it known at whose work such criticism is directed?
We have a few moments in the satires in which Horace mocks contemporary writers. And he mocks them for being bloated, for writing stuff that is kind of pretentious and excessive, and for writing too much. That is a very, very consistent criticism of other writers in the satires and epistles. And it again, by saying those people over there do it that way, he is placing himself in this Kallimachian tradition of kind of finely honed, carefully crafted, much smaller verse. I wonder whether the beginning of the Ars Poetica is meant to be not exactly a criticism of Virgil's Aeneid, but a comment on Virgil's Aeneid, because the figure that appears in the beginning is very, very reminiscent of Scylla, this female creature from mythology. And the description of it in the beginning of the Ars Poetica is quite similar to the way that Virgil describes Scylla in his Aeneid. And I'm still working on making this argument and making this connection, and I think it goes much deeper than this as well. But if you imagine the Ars Poetica as a product of late 1st century BCE Rome, Horace was writing this at roughly the same time that Virgil, who we know he was very good friends and intellectual colleagues with, was writing the Aeneid. But the Ars Poetica has been treated so much as not a product of 1st century BCE Rome that people haven't really looked for this connection. I don't think that Horace is criticizing Virgil, except in the sense that he ought as a friend to criticize him, which is to make his poem better. But I think that there are a number of places where the Ars Poetica allows us to see kind of the Aeneid coming into existence. And it allows us to see how Horace reacted to the Aeneid. And it allows us to even have glimpses at this kind of back and forth that I'm sure these poets surely had as they shared their work with each other. So there's both critique of other poets throughout Horace's verses, but there's also glimpses at this very collaborative back and forth compositional method that I see as very likely real.
So just do maybe 2 or 3 more questions. Marcy Person, and I apologize for anyone's name who I mispronounced, says, it's a very thought-provoking evaluation of the Ars Poetica. But the question is, for a manual to be pseudo-didactic, do you think it is necessary for the technical skill they purport to relate to already be well known to be common knowledge? And what could your reading about the Ars Poetica tell us about first century BCE in Rome?
It's an interesting question. So these mock didactic works on cooking, they're essentially epic poems or very long didactic poems about how to prepare different kinds of dishes, or very clearly about writing instead. So they tell you how to combine the ingredients together in the right measures and what kinds of ingredients go well together. And so while they purport to be about cooking, they're really about writing. I think that the idea, right, is that both of these fields of activity, both cooking and writing, are something that people reading these works did with great regularity, and that you're familiar enough with cooking that you can understand the description of cooking to be a description of writing, and you're familiar enough with writing that you can understand the cooking to really be describing writing. If you think about Horace's Ars Amatoria, right, it purports to be this handbook of seduction. Did the first century BCE Romans really need a handbook advising them how to seduce each other's wives? Probably not. We would imagine that they're all doing it quite widely anyway. So I think the idea that the thing being taught is something that is very familiar to you is quite natural, right? It's difficult to pick up an Ars Grammatica and begin teaching yourself grammar from that unless you know a certain amount of grammar to begin with. What I would add is, and this is what to me is so intriguing about the Ars Poetica, Ovid was called praeceptor amoris, the teacher of love, right? Because of this Ars Amatoria that he wrote. And that seems like a plainly amusing fiction. Horace presents himself as praeceptor artis poeticae, the teacher of an art of poetry. And that is just so plausible enough to be true. And people who want to be poets want it to be true enough that they have seen through praeceptor amoris as a kind of amusing fiction, but they have kind of swallowed praeceptor artis poeticae, kind of hook, line, and sinker, as if only I read this, I will learn everything, and then I will be great like Horace. So I think yes, you do need a certain amount of familiarity. And the more familiarity you have, the more you would read these works in different and deeper ways.
So 2 more questions, and some we won't be able to get to, and I apologize to those folks, but you can always email. Simon Ev9 asks, is there a wide field of ancient work regarding which the confusion over ex arte and de arte may be obscuring their meaning?
There is not a wide field of work on this confusion of de arte and ex arte. But when I think this is very clear from the practicing poets, of which I am not one, who read the Ars Poetica and discern in it what literary scholars do not. I think it is very clear that people have read the Ars Poetica one way or the other. The people who have read it as teaching through its precepts have found it not very interesting, and the people that have found it as teaching through its form and the substance that it takes have found it much more valuable. But the reason why I really like that 12th century commentary is that person put their finger exactly on the issue that then somehow got lost in the scholarly conversation, because all the commentaries build on earlier commentaries. But somehow that point in the scholarly conversation got lost and didn't make it through into kind of 18th, 19th, 20th century scholarly work.
And the last question, I'll go to Yolanda Martinez San Miguel. Aristotle's Poetics is a treatise on the different modes of theatrical representation that has been transformed into a treatise about artistic production in general in most anthologies on literary theory. Is Horace's poem about art in general, or is it also specific to one artistic genre?
This is a great final question, and it allows me to sort of tie everything together. One of the reasons why the poem has kind of had the story around it that it has always had, that it was written as a manual, perhaps under commission, for the sons, especially of the Piso family, on writing drama, is because the poem is very, very concerned with drama. It talks about drama at great length. And people have found this odd because Horace doesn't write drama. He writes lots of other genres. He writes literary epistle, he writes epodes, he writes odes, he writes lyric poetry, he writes satire, but he doesn't write drama. So what is he doing purporting to be a teacher of how to write drama? The explanation to this has traditionally been, well, he couldn't write about epic because Virgil was writing an epic, but he also didn't write about epic. Horace himself also did not write an epic. I think that drama is there as this flag that what Horace is really interested in is sort of the drama of life, right? He's not telling you how to write characters that are believable. He's telling you how people should behave at different times of their lives. And that's really where the connection with the satires comes in. So it pretends to be, for the most part, a poem with a list of instructions about how to write a drama. Things like have 5 acts, don't have more than 3 speaking characters, right? These very obvious kind of unnecessary statements. But it so clearly is also about how to do everything, right? How to be a friend, how to be a good critic, how to be a father and a son, how to be a teacher, how to receive teachings, right? And this is really, I think, what Horace is always talking about, right? On the one hand, he's always talking about writing. And on the other hand, he's always talking about just how to be a person in the world. But those two things for him are really the same. They're two sides of the same coin.
Well, thank you so much. And I think we'll wrap it up. And I'm sure we all learned a lot. And so thank you again, Professor Ferriss-Hill, for such a great presentation. And I'll remind everybody that we have lots more great book talks coming up. And so check our website. And have a great evening.